Hello and welcome back to the Pod Well Travelled. I'm your host Megan French, and today's episode is all about literary travel destinations, inspired by writers and made famous by writers. Many bookworms flock to these fascinating locations globally thanks to their literary allure. And joining me in the studio today to unpack this concept is travel editor Stephen Scourfield and Writing WA CEO Will Yeoman, who regular listeners will know very well and recognise as he used to host this podcast and was the literary editor at the West Australian for quite some time. Welcome back to the pod.
Thank you. It's always a pleasure to come back to my old haunt.
Nice to have you back, Will.
Before we get stuck into iconic literary travel destinations, I'm keen to hear about if either of you have embarked on a literary travel adventure of some sort and where you've been. I know, Stephen, you had a peculiar trip to Wales when you were young. Is that correct?
Yeah, well, it's funny thinking about preparing for this podcast and thinking about being inspired by locations, and I went, wow, when I was a kid, I literally took off. I grew up in England, in rural England, and took off to Larne in South Wales, which is where Dylan Thomas lived and wrote. And he wrote Under Milk Wood, the play for voices in Larne. This is a copy of Under Milk Wood, which I bought at that village. I was just completely inspired by Dylan, and that absolutely was literary travel. I mean, I went there to see the White Cross and the writing shed and at the boathouse, which is now a museum in Larne. So anyone interested in Larne can have the experience that I did in 1974. Actually.
So did you begin at the beginning?
that is the beginning of Under Milk Wood.
All right.
The very famous Richard Burton recording. So, I'd heard
beautiful
this,
recording.
And just the pace, the lyricism, the poetry, it's something that still inspires me, and I hope to get into some of my writing. But thinking back to me as, I was 12, 13, and I literally kind of took off on the train to find this place because I wanted to see the boat shed. And as it turns out, the boat shed in which he wrote Under Milk Wood was made by a carpenter called Scourfield.
In the family line?
Well, all the Scourfield, there's not many Scourfields.
So it would be a distant relative of some sort?
Yeah, Scourfield is a Welsh name. My grandfather was a Welsh-speaking Welshman.
Wow.
So yes, there's some weird connection perhaps, but absolutely. So my literary travel, when I think about it, definitely started when I was 13.
Began right back at the beginning. And what about you, Will?
Very well done. Look, I have to admit, I haven't embarked on a uniquely literary tour. It's always been more about the arts more broadly, so it would have included literature and the visual arts and so forth. Architecture especially, I love to visit old churches and so forth. So to go to places where certain authors might be buried. For example, what's that town in England where Lewis Carroll... Oh no, it was the original Alice, sorry, not Lewis Carroll, but the Alice whom he based the books on. So to visit her gravesite, and you'll forgive me, I can't remember the very small English village where that church is. It's somewhere in Somerset. So places like that, I'm very interested in. Probably not so much the really iconic, everyone can go to Westminster Abbey and all the rest of it and go to Poets' Corner, all those kinds of things. I like to find those slightly quirky, off the beaten track churches and so forth. But as part of what I call a church crawl, you'll appreciate that. You go visit old church.
Yes. Look, all of that landscape you're recreating in my mind there, and also, of course, which I haven't even got in my notes here, was the Tolkien landscape.
Oh, of course.
I mean, the whole Lord of the Rings effort was written. Tolkien lived in Birmingham, travelled in the West Country and Wales, and it was set in that landscape. I mean, the New Zealanders have sort of claimed it through the films, but it's a very, very...
And you think about Thomas Hardy too, if you're talking about landscapes.
So I mean, I think people do absolutely go to these locations to see these places.
Yeah.
And the UK is just full of literary destinations.
Yeah, what about you?
Well, I am a fan of classic English literature, so I'm reading Daphne du Maurier now.
There you are. You're in Cornwall.
Rebecca?
Yeah, Rebecca, yes.
There's on YouTube, you can watch like a 90s vintage 3 hours, but it's a kind of compressed, TV version with Charles Dance, who plays the lead character. It's pretty funny, actually. I recommend it because it's showing its age, shall we say. Faye Dunaway, who's had more work than, I don't know anyone I can imagine, is hilarious. But anyway, that's off the... Sorry to interrupt, but I thought I would throw that in.
That landscape, Do you know the landscape or just through the books?
I have actually spent a lot of my life down in Cornwall because my great aunt and my great uncle live just behind where Daphne du Maurier lived in Foy or Badinnick. So throughout my childhood, whenever we caught the ferry over to Foy, my great aunt would say that's the house Daphne du Maurier wrote her first novel in. And I hadn't read Daphne yet, but now just getting stuck into her world, it's just fascinating, and it's unlocked a new kind of perspective of the place that I've spent so much of my life.
Yeah, that's interesting. So that's the other way round almost, isn't it?
Yeah, exactly. And I would obviously love to go throughout other places in the UK as well, like the Bronte Museum for the Bronte sisters and a few other locations, but the Cornwall is definitely up there for me. And the next time I go back, which is next year, definitely going to work that into my itinerary.
Amazing.
Yeah.
It's interesting, isn't it, whether, the landscape is, inspires the work, but we're inspired by the work in the landscape. So there's this sort of weird cycle, isn't there, almost, where, as you say, the landscape, now you're reading about it, and it's reinvigorating or reinventing it almost in your mind.
And especially in Rebecca with Manderley, and you can really tell her passion and just love for the English countryside as well. Sure. Yeah, beautiful. And we'll get into literary festivals soon because I know that there is one in Foy I would like to discuss.
I've got to ask you another question now. We're right off piste here.
No, that's fine.
You've done it. You've done a run sheet. We've got notes. What about Brontes? Are you reading that?
Yeah, so
have you read?
I like Jane Eyre.
Because that again is set in landscape so strongly, isn't it?
Yeah,
and
definitely.
Places you can really visit.
Yeah, and you can tell in Jane Eyre as well. I went to Haddon Hall in Derbyshire to see there because I had seen the film, obviously, as well. But the Bronte sisters are, definitely up there for me. And I just also find the way that they grew up and how their landscape affected all three of them in terms of they didn't have a privileged childhood, yet it really shows in the way that they began storytelling with the chess set that they were given when they were little. And I find the Bronte sisters very fascinating.
This is what I was getting to before. Both of you can think about this. Is that you might know the landscape, and then you read these works, and we'll stick with the Brontes in that landscape. And then you go to these locations, and you can perhaps do you feel it differently? Do you feel what the author felt in that place? So it sort of elevates the experience.
Well, it gives you another perspective, I would say.
It does, doesn't it? Because you can be standing there feeling what Emily Bronte felt when she's describing those landscapes.
Yeah,
it's
definitely.
Really interesting.
I think, well, for me, again, I think we're jumping around a bit on the run sheet here. Because I know there are things further on which will tie into what we're talking about now. But I mean, London's always been the most literary city for me, and to have lived there for a while and experience all that's very important. And I think having been a lover of Dickens's novels, Charles Dickens from way back, to be able to step into his world and for me to be able to think, well, this is exactly as I imagined it. This is Dickens' London. It was quite something.
Yeah, magical.
So I understand what you're both saying.
Yeah, in the urban landscape.
I'm talking about
absolutely.
Clearly the built environment, the architecture, the streets, the people, everything, the sights and smells. You imagine that perhaps not much has changed, not as much as you might have imagined. So...
Yeah, as well as the historical education that, I've personally received through reading books that I didn't receive in high school or in primary school. It kind of offers a more of a personal perspective of historical events as well.
Well, it's interesting you say that because there's a big move at the moment that a lot of university students are feeling like they're not getting that kind of education anymore. And so there are a lot of opportunities opening up, some of them started by these students, others by lecturers, to offer a different kind of humanist education to introduces them to what they call the great books, the classic books, and give them that broad education that makes them, a more... I won't say better human being, but you know what I'm saying. It's not specific to any kind of job, or so forth. And I love that. So young people who are at uni now are recognising that there's something missing, which is exactly what you've talked about.
I think it's also feeling cultured and educated on
absolutely,
on the past as well.
It's interesting that that's still important, isn't it?
Yeah, I think it will always be important.
I think you're right.
Yeah. And so are there any locations where you haven't been yet but you would like to go in terms of literary destinations?
Can I start? Because it's easy. Because it's exactly what we've just been talking about, Haworth. I've never been there. I've read the Bronte sisters, Jane Eyre, Wuthering Heights and so forth. Been to places near there, lived in that part of the country for a while. So I've been close enough to know what the rugged, Gothic landscape is actually like. But I would love to actually go to Howth and go to the museum and see the houses and so forth. So that's my bucket list item.
And what about you, Stephen?
One thing I do sort of advise the audience to think about is there's still these things called printed books, and they're great, because you don't have to plug them in and charge them. And you can carry them around with you, and there are some places, and I'm thinking about India now, where digging around old bookshops just is full of treasures, because that's where you'll find the Indian writers that you won't find, in bookstores online or anything else. One of those is Rabindranath Tagore, who's a very famous Indian writer, and I've been collecting his books from poky old Indian bookshops for as long as I can remember. And just north of Kolkata, there's a couple of 100 kilometres north of Kolkata, it's almost like an Indian style of university town, I suppose, which was set up for him and funded by him as a place of study, which I've been to. And I'd love to go there. And actually, I was only there for a couple of days. I'd love to go there and spend time there. So there are some places, and reabsorb his work. He was a poet, a novelist, songwriter, and very involved in the sort of freedom movement for India. That stimulates me to want to go back. Just looking through even the books I brought in, Bruce Chatwin was a significant writer for me as a young writer. In Patagonia was really his seminal travel writing work, which also has a lot of content about the Welsh in Patagonia.
Okay.
So there was a connection there. And I can stand in those landscapes and see through Bruce's eyes. And I was only prompted by you suggesting this podcast, Megan, to revisit the Songlines, which is a book that Chatwin wrote about Australia, which I read when I was still a kid in England, and see that as part of my journey here as well. It's really interesting, as was Robin Davison's book Tracks. Robin got camels in Alice Springs and walked to the West Australian coast. And I read that in 1970-something in Essex and thought, wow, that sounds amazing. And sort of here I am. So I think these things have such an influence on us. These created landscapes in literature, live within us. Here I am living in that book, basically.
Yeah, exactly. And I think it's also fascinating when you read a book and when you're reading it for the first time, you don't understand how it's going to affect you for so many years, and just the weight of it and how much it will influence you, just like the book that you just mentioned. Did you think that contributed to you moving to Australia, or?
Yeah, I think it did. I think it was actually possibly quite conscious. When I got the kind of job offer here, it was a place that I sort of knew through this book and went, it sounded so wild, why wouldn't you? Yeah, and I do see that, people in my life it was easier for me, say, with Indigenous people and with Outback, and I kind of had an introduction to them through the book anyway, and even my wife is such a Robin Davison sort of character, in terms of being so comfortable in the Outback and in the deserts. So yeah, look, I think it's very much part of my life. If I hadn't read that book, hey, what would have happened?
Might not be here today, who knows?
Hey, still living in London.
And so for literary festivals, obviously there's no shortage of those globally. There's an abundance are all over the UK, options such as Hay Festival in Wales, Edinburgh International Book Festivals in Scotland, and then there's other parts of the world, including Ubud Writers and Readers Festival in Indonesia and the Istanbul International Literature Festival in Turkey. So I'm curious to know where you guys have attended a literary festival, if you have, and was it worth it? What did you get out of it? What was in store?
I think we should start with Will. Will was the director of the Perth Festival Writers Week for many years, a number of years. So Will's our literature, and the York Festival.
Well, I can see we're going to talk about that.
You're a festival guy.
I was going to get onto that, Stephen. But
No.
Whoops, I was just...
You should try reading the run sheet, I have to admit, I haven't been to any of the larger festivals internationally because I'm not I'm actually not that comfortable with crowds. And if you go to somewhere like Ubud or Jaipur, for example, there are thousands of people in the program, let alone people attending. That's not for me. So if I'm somewhere in the world, I'll probably go to a nice quieting conversation at one of the local bookstores. If we're talking about London again, I might go to the London Review of Books, which is quite near the British Museum. And you can listen to those podcasts now because I can't visit London so conveniently. But for me, one of my favourite experiences is probably at the Singapore Writers' Festival, which is unique in the world because it uses the 4 official languages. So to have that experience, to sit next to a Chinese poet and basically read the English translations while he's performing the Chinese versions as part of the festival is really special. So I guess I'm someone that will probably go if I'm actually involved, because I'm kind of in this space where you're so busy, unless it's for work, you tend not to do it. Same with Melbourne. I was fortunate enough to go over to Melbourne and do some facilitating there as well, and that's another great literary festival. But yeah, to be honest with you, just to recap, my experiences of big international festivals are quite meagre, to be honest. So.
But with your experience in directorship of city and regional literary festivals, what do you think is the most important aspect to putting on a literary festival or a literary event?
I think one of the most important things is that you can never please everybody all of the time, but you really do need to try to recognise who your core audience is, but also try to grow new audiences and bring new audiences in. For example, this year for Perth Festival Writers Weekend, we were very aware that there's a certain core audience of a certain age, shall we say, but we wanted to program sessions that would appeal directly to younger people. And we did do that, and we did see a change in demographic, a lot more younger people in the audiences. So that's the first thing. The second thing is it has to be entertaining. No one wants to sit there for an hour and be bored by two, authors just basically, you know what I'm saying,
Talking
Stephen.
about themselves.
Yeah, and less about the book. So to me, it has to be informative, entertaining, engaging, and appeal to as many people as is possible.
Around Australia, I'm probably in the medium-sized festivals. Brisbane, I think, is a super writers festival. Sydney's, a bigger business, but still a lot of the sessions around Sydney units are quite intimate, so I do like the intimate sessions. But Jaipur, I have been to, and it was almost just too confusing. So I think what Will's saying is sort of right, that some of them turn into almost industry events rather than visitor events. So I'd aim for something that's, Perth was a good example. Brisbane, I think, is my standout example. And I've been to the Hay Festival. And what you can do at festivals like Hay is the phrase that comes to mind is skirt around the edges. You can pick you can pick little events that are sort of not too busy, quite intimate in smaller venues. And that works really well for, if you want just a quiet and more intense experience rather than the whole big events that they put on at Hay. But Hay's a fantastic festival. I mean, it just works without getting itself lost in too much noise.
And out of curiosity, what time of year is the Jaipur Literary Festival?
Jaipur's in the cooler months, usually September-ish. Look, honestly, Jaipur is so amazing that I probably wouldn't bother with the literary festival because it's just too confusing. Getting around and that. You might as well just go and be in Jaipur. That's enough.
Yeah, definitely. Personally, I have not been to a literary festival internationally yet, but I'm planning on going to the Foy Festival of Arts and Literature in May next year. And that's run by the Du Maurier Festival Society in Cornwall.
Wow.
It used to, yes. I was chatting to my great aunt the other day and she said that it used to be a festival just celebrating Daphne du Maurier, but now it's turned into more of a generalised literary festival. And I think that going to Cornwall, seeing where she really pictured those landscapes and poured that emotion into her writing would be incredible, especially surrounded by everyone else who can appreciate Daphne's writing.
Yeah.
Would love to go to that one. Yeah, so that's in May next year.
Fantastic. Yeah. Okay. We'll look forward to hearing that report from you when you get back.
Yes, I shall report back when I'm back. And for any curious listeners who may be feeling inspired to attend a literary festival, I will be posting a video on our TikTok account later this week just a rundown of all of the upcoming festivals over the next year with dates and information. So if you would like to know that, just head over to our TikTok account at The Pod Well Travelled. And so now I'd like to move on to your own writing. So as many readers know, Stephen has published a plethora of books throughout his career, both fiction and non-fiction. And I understand 2 of your novels are set in the Kimberley. So do you want to talk to us about them and what inspired you to choose that region?
Sure. The Kimberley in the north of WA, for anyone listening elsewhere, north of Western Australia, is remote agricultural cattle country, and I'd spent so much time there on travel assignments, but I knew it so well. I had so many friends there on cattle stations, and you start to build up this body of knowledge, I suppose. For me, you need a massive amount of knowledge and information to gently simmer down into fiction. Fiction is always like a cooking process where you simmer and simmer and simmer, and it becomes more viscous. And you need a sort of 44-gallon drum of information simmered down into a cupful to create fiction. So that's what happened. I'd travelled there, I'd mustered cattle with indigenous musterers on horseback, and experienced all sorts of strange and interesting things with them. I had a very close friend who had a million acre station, and we used to muster together, and he had his life story tattooed around his body, and used to throw bulls with his bare hands and all that sort of stuff. So all this stuff was going on, and I was making notes about the sheds and the tools they use and the vehicles and how they fix them and what they wear. And that was really set in a very male culture, and all the problems that come with that, with this kind of quite aggressive male behaviour and histories. So that was other country. And then I was interested in the change that had happened in that area over 20 years, which I'd experienced and witnessed, I should say. So the second book, As the River Runs, is set in the same landscape 20 plus years later, when Indigenous ownership, conservation, tourism have all changed not the landscape, but the use of the landscape and human interaction with the landscape enormously. And I was interested in that shift.
What year was that?
So we're
looking,
the other country was sort of set probably, let's say, 1980, and As the River Runs really is contemporary.
Yeah, it's interesting to hear an author's perspective on the landscape and then how you translated that into the books. I haven't read them. I would love to. But did you go into the kind of societal issues at the time?
Yeah, absolutely.
Will, based on your experience of being a writer, what do you believe makes a location special enough to write about, and what are the factors at play here?
Look, I mean, it's so individual and personal. I mean, I don't have Stephen's experience as a novelist and so forth. However, I must say I've recently dipped my toes, shall we say, in the more creative side of writing. I've recently been published in a collection of what they call micro-memoirs. So it's a short story, and this is in answer to your question. So for that one, I went back to the 1980s in York, which is just 100 k's east of Perth, for those of you who don't know, and immersed myself in the rural landscape there, and particularly working in shearing sheds and so forth at the time, but also talking about the whole familial relationship with my mother was Samoan, so there was a whole lot of racism and enduring that, and there was the repercussions for us, even though we're not quite of the same colour, shall we say. It had a lot of effect on the family. So to tie all that in, that's what typically happens to an author if they have an attachment, whether it's biographical or whether it's somewhere they've visited and they love, to weave that into their fiction or even their creative non-fiction. It's so personal, and you would know this, and you've kind of answered this yourself. It's so individual, even though it's fiction, it's still coming from the way you feel and about certain things and so forth. So I think that's absolutely vital. And secondly, it's that power. And again, you have this to be able to describe, the whole adage, show, don't tell, which is so important. You really need to be able to bring to life the characters, the landscapes and so forth. So that's absolutely vital, I think, because it's so akin to travel writing too. You need to make as you know from reading Daphne du Maurier, you need to make the reader feel as though they are actually right there, immersed in the entire experience.
Definitely, yeah. And Stephen, what do you think about the most important aspects of somewhere inspiring you to write about it?
Yeah, I agree with Will, but there is an inherent connection that you need. Just to go back, I grew up in the English landscape, inspired by Dylan Thomas, and quite recently wrote a novella called Bird, which was about a photographer's life growing up in that landscape. So obviously it's reflective of parts of my own life. But a strong landscape, be it the Lake District or the Bodmin Moor in Cornwall or the Kimberley. I was watching a painter recently, and the first thing that he did on his canvas was put a colour wash on. He just put lots of splashes of colour and stripes and things, and then just wash it all in so that you've taken the white off and you've got a colour base. And the landscape gives you that, so that you can then start to paint portraits and details and farm buildings and so on that backdrop. So I think the landscape gives you a foundation and a canvas upon which you can impose.
Love that analogy.
Definitely.
What do you think are key elements to consider when planning a travel itinerary in terms of literary destinations?
I think for me, simplicity and compactness are really good things, because there's so much that can go wrong and there's so much that's unpredictable. So the simpler you can keep it, the better. And so to go back to London again is a great example, because it's such a compact city, not in terms of size, of course, but in terms of the density of culture that's located in one place. You can plan a multitude of literary itineraries just in that one city alone. And I was just reminding myself of Cheyne Walk, which is just near the Battersea Bridge. If you just did that, that's a very famous part of London, notable for all sorts of person. But I'm looking at the list of writers there that have lived in that part of town. There's, George Eliot, Bertrand Russell. You've got Dante Gabriel Rossetti, Algernon Charles Swinburne. That list is massive. I had the fortune to live not far from there for a period of time and was able to walk the walk on a daily basis by the Thames and visit all these places and see those famous blue plaques everywhere. So that alone would be enough for one itinerary. So I guess that's a good example. And then there's a whole sort of Dickens London, which we talked about before. There's Bloomsbury, of course, Virginia Woolf and, all her sort of coevals. And there's also Dr. Johnson as well. You can go to his house. He was famous for writing the first English dictionary. His house is just off Fleet Street. Fleet Street's very famous. You'd know Fleet Street very well, having started your career there. So, yeah, for me, if you're planning an itinerary and you're able to go somewhere internationally, maybe London's a perfect starting point.
And I like that idea of trying to condense it rather than scraping the surface of many locations.
Absolutely.
Really dive deep into one location and get to know it.
Yeah, big fan of that.
Yeah,
definitely.
Exactly. More intimate level. And Stephen?
Well, I'm going to take what you've just said and take it a bit further, because I think if you take one book that you totally love, so if I was going to use an example myself, if you take The Shipping News by Annie Proulx, which is just this fantastic book which I love to bits. So I don't know how many times I've read it or listened to it, as an audiobook or whatever. Set in Newfoundland, up on that, northeast American coast. Perhaps there's another book there, Michael Crummey's Galore is set in that landscape as well. But if I would take a book that you love and I would go to that location, I'd go and stand in the middle of it. Because if you've read a book like that, which is completely imbued with the coast and the landscape and the fishing and these crazy characters who live in this sort of outpost, extreme environment, does it attract extreme people and extreme characters, or does it create them? I'm not sure. But you get this extreme feeling in this place, slightly crazy people doing slightly crazy things in a wacky place. And if you read that and loved that and loved those characters, just go there and be in the middle of it.
That goes back to what we were talking about earlier, doesn't it? About how it impacts you or experience of landscape through the work.
Exactly. So take a book you love and go and stand in the middle of it.
Okay, that's all we have time for today. Thanks so much for joining me today, Stephen and Will. We will be back again next week with another episode of The Pod Well Travelled. In the meantime, you can keep up to date with all of our stories at thewest.com.au/travel and on social media on TikTok at The Pod Well Travelled and Instagram at The Pod_Well Travelled. See you next time.